Above the earth, a silent battle was unfolding, a battle that would shift the balance of power between East and West. The flight of President Ibrahim Traoré to Moscow, initially perceived as a mere diplomatic mission, was suddenly intercepted by American and French fighter jets. But in the skies, an unexpected ally intervened, risking a confrontation that could alter history. What would follow would send shockwaves across the world. A peaceful morning in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The sun shone brightly as President Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk in the presidential palace, reviewing the final details of his upcoming trip. He had been invited by President Vladimir Putin to Moscow to attend the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The occasion included a significant military parade on Red Square, a powerful symbol of Russia's strength and resilience. For Ibrahim, this trip was far more than mere attendance at a celebration. It was a bold statement to the world. Since taking power, he had worked tirelessly to restore Burkina Faso's sovereignty, distancing his country from the influence of Western powers. His growing ties with Russia were seen by many as a move toward true independence, a challenge to the former imperial powers that had long controlled Africa's destiny. In the West, the growing concern of the United States and France, two nations with long-standing interests in Africa, was no longer concealed. They had openly expressed their disapproval of Burkina Faso's increasing alignment with Russia. American and French officials, in private meetings, had warned against any actions that might threaten their influence in the region. As the date of his departure approached, Ibrahim knew this trip would not be a mere diplomatic mission. It was a test, a challenge to the powers that had long dominated Africa. Would they allow him to reach Russia and participate in this event, or would they do everything to stop him? At the moment of takeoff, Ibrahim knew the stakes were higher than ever. The crew was on high alert, aware that the flight could be interrupted at any moment. As the plane gained altitude, Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, watching the vast expanse of the African landscape disappear below. He was heading toward a new chapter for Burkina Faso. But how would he proceed? A few hours after takeoff, everything seemed normal. Ibrahim's plane cruised peacefully through the air, the steady hum of the engines blending with the quiet murmur of the crew. However, as the plane crossed the Atlantic, a strange signal appeared on the radar. Two fast-moving dots were heading toward it. The crew was immediately alerted. They instantly recognized the shapes on their radar screens. American and French military fighter jets intercepting the flight path of Ibrahim's plane. These were not ordinary commercial aircraft. At first, the pilots thought it might be a mistake. But as the fighter jets drew closer, the situation became clear. This was indeed an interception. Ibrahim remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he observed the fighters approach. His mind began to race. He was prepared for opposition, but this was unexpected. The communication system crackled, and a stern voice from the U.S. military ordered, "The airspace was restricted. You are ordered to land immediately. You are entering restricted airspace. Repeat, land immediately." Ibrahim leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. This was not merely a misunderstanding. It was an act of defiance. The United States and France were clearly attempting to prevent his trip to Russia, to stop him from participating in the victory celebrations in Moscow. But Ibrahim Traoré was not the kind to back down from a challenge. The pilots exchanged glances, awaiting instructions. Ibrahim knew what had to be done. The country's sovereignty and the message he carried were too important to be threatened by foreign forces. He looked out the window, watching the American and French fighter jets close in on his aircraft, locking onto its position. "I will not land," Ibrahim said calmly to his captain. "Continue. We will not deviate." The crew nodded, understanding. They knew this was not just a flight. It was a statement. But the risks were high. The situation could quickly escalate. Then, as the tension reached its peak, a new sound filled the air. The familiar roar of jet engines coming from a different direction. A squadron of Russian fighter jets appeared on Ibrahim's radar, moving swiftly to provide air support. As the Russian fighters flew over the Western forces, they were forced to reconsider their position. They had come to stop Traoré's flight, but now they were facing Russia, a country that did not yield easily. After hours of tense negotiations, the American and French forces backed down, reluctantly. Their fighter jets withdrew, leaving the airspace. Ibrahim's plane was able to continue its journey to Russia. The standoff was over, but the implications of what had just happened would resonate for years to come. Ibrahim Traoré's flight to Russia had become a symbol of defiance and an undeniable statement that Burkina Faso would no longer be intimidated or threatened with Russia's support. Ibrahim had faced the power of two Western superpowers and prevailed. As the plane soared smoothly through the sky once more, Ibrahim settled back into his seat, his mind still racing. The danger had passed, but he knew the world was watching. The journey to Russia was more than a diplomatic trip. It was a bold declaration to the world. Burkina Faso was free, and no one would stop it. The hours following the dramatic interception in the skies felt like an eternity for Ibrahim Traoré. His plane had been surrounded by American and French fighter jets, a show of force meant to prevent him from reaching Russia. The tension on board was palpable, and every passing minute seemed to bring them closer to an international incident. Despite the imminent threat, Ibrahim remained calm. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon as the Western fighter jets closed in on his aircraft. The radio crackled again, breaking the silence. A cold, firm voice, this time from the U.S. military command. "President Traoré, this is the United States Air Force. You are violating an airspace restriction. You must divert your course immediately. Failure to comply will result in direct consequences." Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated some form of resistance, but this surpassed anything he had imagined. The Americans and French were acting with unprecedented aggression, as if determined to stop him at all costs. The mission, meant to be a peaceful diplomatic visit, was now becoming. Faced with the prospect of his choice, Ibrahim felt the weight of history on his shoulders. The entire world was watching, and the outcome of this confrontation, whether through his submission or resistance, would symbolize either the continued subjugation of Africa by foreign powers or a powerful message that would shake the foundations of global politics. "I will not land," Ibrahim declared in a firm, resolute voice. "We continue our journey. We do not deviate." His words echoed through the air, and the aircraft's commander nodded, understanding the stakes. The pilots and crew had been briefed on the importance of this flight, and they now had to see it through, despite the risks. Minutes stretched into hours as the Western fighter jets flanked Ibrahim's aircraft. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The situation had escalated. Any sudden move could trigger a clash between superpowers. But just as the tension seemed to reach its breaking point, a new voice cut through the radio static, like a bolt of lightning. "This is Russian Air Command. We have been ordered to escort President Traoré to his destination. Move your aircraft." The tone of the Russian voice was commanding, its appearance as unexpected as it was abrupt. The American and French jets hesitated, their pilots stunned by the sudden presence of Russian fighters on their radar. The Russian fighters were not merely escorting an African leader. They were sending a clear message to the Western powers. "I repeat," the Russian voice continued, "President Traoré's plane is under our protection. We will not allow any interference with his flight." As the Russian jets took position, the Western aircraft backed off. The dynamics of the conflict had radically shifted. What had begun as an aggressive move by the United States and France now resembled a dangerous game of brinkmanship, one that neither side wished to escalate. The Western forces, faced with Russia's military might, had no choice but to withdraw. For a few tense moments, the two sides faced off in the sky. Then gradually, the American and French jets pulled back. The Russian jets held their position, ensuring Ibrahim's aircraft could continue its journey to Russia. The standoff ended without a single shot fired, but the world had witnessed a dramatic shift. Under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso had defied Western power, and Russia's support had been the decisive factor. For Ibrahim, this flight to Moscow was more than a diplomatic mission. It was a turning point for Burkina Faso and the entire world. Ibrahim's flight to Moscow had become more than a journey. It was a powerful statement to the world. Africa would no longer be silenced, backed by Russia. Burkina Faso had sent a clear message. Sovereignty, freedom, and independence were non-negotiable. The journey continued, but the repercussions of this dramatic confrontation would be felt far beyond the skies. As the plane headed toward Moscow, Ibrahim knew his message had been delivered loud and clear. Africa was no longer passive. It was taking its place in the world as an independent and powerful force. The world had just witnessed a confrontation between two superpowers over a simple reason: a flight. And in the end, it was Ibrahim Traoré, with Russia's support, who had won the day. The hours following the dramatic interception felt like an eternity. Ibrahim Traoré sat in his seat, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The American and French jets, initially a threat to his journey, had backed down. The sky, once a battlefield between global powers, was silent again, with only the steady hum of the engines. But the world had witnessed an unprecedented moment. A leader from Burkina Faso, a small African nation, had stood up to two of the world's most powerful forces with Russia's support. As the plane flew smoothly toward Moscow, Ibrahim reflected on the significance of this event. He had been part of history, but this was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for Africa as a whole. It proved that when African leaders stood firm and were backed by powerful allies like Russia, they could challenge the old imperialism that had enslaved the continent for centuries. The confrontation in the sky was more than a physical clash. It was a symbolic moment that would inspire African leaders and citizens for generations to come. The crew of Ibrahim's plane had done their job, guiding the aircraft through the turbulence of the sky and ensuring the president's message was clear. As the situation calmed, the aircraft's commander allowed himself a moment of relief. The worst had passed. The Western forces had withdrawn, and they were free to continue their flight. Yet, despite the restored calm, it was impossible to ignore that what had just happened was not merely an isolated event. It was part of a larger global struggle for independence, for sovereignty, for Africa to finally take its place on the world stage without interference from foreign powers. Burkina Faso, led by Ibrahim Traoré, was now the focal point of this struggle. Several hours later, Ibrahim's plane landed in Moscow. His final destination was reached after this tension-filled journey. Vnukovo International Airport welcomed him, and the sight of Russian authorities awaiting him signaled that he had not merely completed an ordinary diplomatic mission, but a symbolic victory for Africa. Vladimir Putin was among those waiting on the tarmac to greet him. The Russian president's face lit up with a warm smile as he extended his hand to Ibrahim. The two leaders shook hands firmly, a silent sign of the bond forged in the heart of this celestial confrontation. "Welcome, President Traoré," Putin said, his voice calm and sincere. "It is a privilege to have you here." Ibrahim nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you, President Putin. It is an honor to be here." The arrival in Moscow was not just about political meetings. It coincided with a significant national event. The 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazism in Germany during World War II was being celebrated with a grand military parade on Red Square, one of the most iconic and powerful events in Russia's history. As they watched the military parade, Ibrahim, faced with the majestic parade, could not help but reflect on the broader symbolism of the event. At the heart of Russia's military might, power was on full display, a clear message to the world about Russia's strength and resilience. But that was not the only impression. The strength of Russia, but also the resilience of nations that had survived history's toughest battles, stood proudly, unshaken by foreign domination. This is what Africa needs: the courage to stand firm, no matter what, in the face of pressure. The will to protect our sovereignty, Ibrahim said quietly to Putin as they watched the parade. Putin nodded. "You are right, President Traoré. The struggle for sovereignty, for independence, is an endless battle. But those who stand firm, who refuse to yield to external pressure, will find their place in history. Russia is with you." Despite the grandeur of the Red Square parade, Ibrahim knew the victory of the day was not only in the military display, but in the message delivered, both in the skies and on the ground. The confrontation in the sky above Moscow had shown the world that Burkina Faso was no longer a passive player on the international political stage. With Russia's support, the country had stood firm against two superpowers. In doing so, it had sent a clear and powerful message about Africa's right to self-determination. The significance of the moment was not lost on Ibrahim. At the heart of Russia, he realized this was not merely a diplomatic visit. It was the beginning of a new era for Africa, an era where the continent's leaders could chart their own path without fear of foreign interference. The celebrations continued in Moscow, but for Ibrahim, the true victory had already been won. Africa was no longer willing to remain silent. With Russia by its side, the continent had found its voice. As the Moscow celebrations were broadcast to the world, a secret remained hidden above the clouds. The dramatic confrontation between the United States, France, and Russia was only reported by a few high-ranking Russian officials and military personnel. The world would never know how close the situation had come to escalating into something much larger. But what mattered was that the confrontation had ended peacefully, with Burkina Faso's sovereignty intact. The days following Ibrahim Traoré's arrival in Moscow were filled with ceremonies, meetings, and moments of reflection. The significance of the skyward confrontation, witnessed only by a few, was now understood by all. Russia had publicly shown its support for Burkina Faso, and the world could feel the repercussions of this new partnership. But for Ibrahim, this visit was more than just attending a military parade. It was a bold affirmation that Africa could stand independent, free from foreign influence. The day after the grand military parade, Ibrahim found himself at a ceremonial breakfast with President Putin and other Russian officials. The atmosphere was warm, but an indefinable tension lingered in the air. Both men knew the gravity of the situation, the consequences of what had transpired in the skies. This was not just a diplomatic visit. Moscow was no longer just about the future of Africa and the shifting balance of global power. Putin's tone was thoughtful as he spoke, his eyes fixed on Ibrahim. His journey here. President Traoré reminded the world that Africa is no longer a pawn in global politics. The struggle for African sovereignty and independence is a cause that every nation must respect. Ibrahim listened intently. He had always admired Putin's pragmatism and resolve, but today he understood that their deep alliance was not solely based on military or economic support. It was an alliance rooted in a shared vision of a world where the sovereignty of nations would be respected, regardless of their size or influence. Burkina Faso and Russia had thus united in a concrete demonstration of this unity. Later that day, President Putin invited Ibrahim to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they met with diplomats and influential Russian political figures. It was there that Putin made a symbolic proposal. "I would like to extend an invitation not only to you but to all African people. If you wish, we can build a stronger partnership between our nations. Let this be the beginning of a new chapter of cooperation." Ibrahim, impressed by this gesture, nodded. This invitation represented more than a mere political maneuver. It symbolized the future. "We are building something new, a future where African nations can choose their own path, without fear or interference from external powers." The offer was clear. Russia was willing to partner with Burkina Faso, and by extension, all of Africa. The idea of African unity, of Pan-African cooperation, was no longer just a vision, but was becoming a reality. It was a decisive turning point in the struggle for African sovereignty. As the day progressed, Ibrahim Traoré realized that his visit to Russia had done more than secure an alliance with a global superpower. It had reignited the flame of Pan-African unity. In a public speech before a gathered crowd of Russians and African diplomats, he spoke of the struggle for African independence. "We are no longer afraid to stand on our own," he declared with strength and conviction. "Today, we stand with Russia, not as subjects, but as equals. Our nations have fought for their freedom for generations, and we are determined to secure our future. We call on all African nations to join us in this struggle, to stand united toward a future where our sovereignty will never again be questioned." His words were met with thunderous applause, and the room vibrated with a new energy. There was a sense of hope in the air, a sense that a true African alliance had been born, and the path forward was one of solid unity. Ibrahim's message resonated far beyond the walls of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The news spread across the world and into the hearts of Africans, sparking a new sense of pride and hope. The invitation was clear. It was time for African nations to unite, to stand together and demand the respect they deserved on the global stage. This speech, powerful in itself, was not just a call to action for Burkina Faso. It was a call to all African leaders and every African citizen to consider the importance of sovereignty, independence, and unity. Ibrahim Traoré had demonstrated that strong alliances like the one with Russia could shift the global power dynamics. The future of Africa, once dictated by the whims of imperial powers, was now in the hands of Africans. Months passed, and the world moved on after the incident. In public discourse, the air conflict between the United States, France, and Russia was largely ignored, swept under the rug. All the celebrations following Ibrahim's trip to Russia concealed the true nature of the standoff. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the significance of that moment could never be erased. It was a moment that demonstrated, to him and to the world, that Africa held its own destiny. The world could ignore the conflict in the skies, but Ibrahim would never forget that event. It was a defining moment that revealed the strength of Burkina Faso, the support of Russia, and the growing unity of Africa in the face of imperialism. Though the information remained secret, the impact of the event was undeniable. The world had seen the courage of African leaders, and winds of change were beginning to blow. In the weeks following his return from Moscow, President Ibrahim Traoré reflected on the events that had unfolded. The flight to Russia had begun as a diplomatic mission, but had transformed into something far greater, a turning point in the struggle for African sovereignty. The air conflict had altered the course of his journey, but also the course of history. Back in Burkina Faso, the news was filled with praise for Traoré's strength and determination. He had faced two superpowers, refused to yield to foreign pressure, and emerged victorious with Russia's support. The world witnessed the story of his confrontation with the United States and France, which slowly became a legend, an inspiring tale of defiance and courage, resonating with people across Africa. The events surrounding Ibrahim's trip to Moscow sparked a renewed sense of pride across the continent. African leaders began to take notice. This was a leader who had stood firm against Western interference and had been backed by Russia, proving that Africa could stand on its own and protect its own interests. It was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about all African nations. The message was clear. Africa would no longer remain a passive player on the global political stage, subject to the whims of foreign powers. Leaders would no longer be dictated to or silenced. It was time for Africa to rise, unite, and shape its own future. Diplomatic relations between African countries and Russia strengthened in the weeks that followed, as did the sense of unity among African nations. Countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Algeria, which had long fought for their independence from colonial domination, now looked to Burkina Faso as an example of how to assert sovereignty in the face of external pressures. Ibrahim Traoré became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for leaders and citizens, demonstrating that Africa could push back against imperialist forces. Ibrahim's trip to Moscow also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Burkina Faso. No longer isolated or dominated by Western powers, the country began to strengthen its economic and military ties with Russia. This new relationship paved the way for developments in infrastructure, trade, and military cooperation that would benefit Burkina Faso for years to come. Ibrahim knew this partnership was just the beginning. Russia's support was valuable, but he also understood the importance of diversification. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso began strengthening ties with other emerging powers, seeking partnerships that would allow his country to thrive without relying on any single nation in the months that followed. He visited China, India, and other nations, building a network of alliances based on mutual respect and shared interests. Burkina Faso was becoming a force to be reckoned with, not only in Africa, but on the global stage. However, the victory in the skies was never achieved without cost. The Western powers, humiliated by their inability to stop Ibrahim's flight, were not quick to forget. Though the conflict was never publicly acknowledged, Western diplomats and military leaders discussed behind closed doors how to neutralize the growing influence of countries like Russia in Africa. Economic pressures on Burkina Faso intensified as Western nations sought to punish the country for its rebellion. Sanctions were imposed, and foreign aid dwindled. Despite this, Ibrahim remained steadfast. He knew that Africa's future did not depend on foreign handouts, but on the resilience and self-sufficiency of its people. While the rest of the world may have forgotten the details of the confrontation, Ibrahim Traoré knew its significance. The victory in the skies proved that no force could dictate Africa's destiny. He had faced two global superpowers, with Russia's support, and emerged unscathed. But this was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for all African nations. As Ibrahim walked the streets of Ouagadougou, greeted with joy and admiration by his people, he realized how far Burkina Faso, once burdened by foreign domination, now walked with its head held high. The people knew their president had stood up to the world's greatest powers, and won, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. In the years that followed, Ibrahim Traoré's leadership continued to inspire, not only in Burkina Faso, but across the African continent. His trip to Moscow became more than a historical event. It became a symbol of the new, united Africa, strong and determined to stand on its own. Calls for African unity grew stronger, and nations began forging alliances among themselves, breaking free from the chains of imperialism that had once subjugated them. Africa's voice, once silent on the global stage, was now heard distinctly and clearly. The message was simple, but powerful. Africa was no longer a continent to be ignored. It was a continent to be respected. Ibrahim's legacy, built on the foundations of independence and sovereignty, had charted a new path for Africa. And though the details of the celestial confrontation were never fully revealed, the spirit of that moment lived on in every leader and every citizen who believed in it. Africa's destiny was for Africa to shape. Ibrahim looked to the future, knowing the journey was not over. The struggle for Africa's true independence must continue, but the path had been set. With courage, unity, and determination, Africa would rise, and the fight for freedom would no longer be just a dream, but a reality. And as President Ibrahim Traoré, he would remain steadfast, a guardian of Africa's future, never willing to let the forces of imperialism dictate the course of his country or his continent. Political broadcast, new messages,